Hello, everyone. We'll give folks just a moment to log on and then we'll get started. Okay. Hello, I'm Chelsea Lake and I'm a member of the events team at Politics and Prose Bookstore, and I'd like to welcome you to PNP Live. At any point during the event, you can click on the link that I'll be putting in the chat to purchase How to Raise a Feminist Son, Motherhood, Masculinity, and the Making of My Family, as well as Recollections of My Nonexistence, a memoir, on the Politics and Prose website. Additionally, you can ask a question by clicking on the Q&A, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. I apologize in advance if we don't have time to address all the questions we receive. We are also delighted to offer closed captioning via Zoom's auto captioning service. To access captions, click on the live transcript option. Just look for the CC image at the bottom of your screen. Finally, I want to thank you again for being with us tonight, and it's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Sonora Jha, PhD, is an essayist, novelist, researcher, and professor of journalism at Seattle University. She is the author of the novel Foreign, and her op-eds and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Seattle Times, The Establishment, Dane, and in several anthologies. She grew up in Mumbai and has been chief of Metropolitan Bureau for the Times of India and contributing editor for East magazine in Singapore. She teaches fiction and essay writing and is an alumna and board member of Hedgebrook Writers Retreat. Rebecca Solnit is the author of more than 20 books, including A Field Guide to Getting Lost, The Faraway Nearby, A Paradise Built in Hell, River of Shadows, and Wonderlust. She is also the author of Men Explain Things to Me and many essays on feminism, activism, and social change, hope, and the climate crisis. A product of the California public education system from kindergarten to graduate school, she is a regular contributor to The Guardian and other publications. Please join me in welcoming them both to PNP Live. Ladies?
Sonora, this is so exciting. It's one of those funny things when I realize that I feel like somebody's already a friend and then that I've never actually spoken to them in person, just written and emailed and sent things and read your work. And hello, how are you?
I'm good. I'm so much better today now that we have an incredible, verdict in a case that we'd all been dreading. But I feel the same way. I mean, of course, you know writers that you admire through their work, and then to be emailing back and forth and to be planning this event and talking about feminism already. And, we would have met somehow if it hadn't been for the pandemic. I would have sought you out. But I'm so glad that we at least get to meet this way. I feel like I've known you for a long, long time because so much in our lives has been similar, and then you speak so many of our minds. So,
well, thank you so much. And oh my God, what an afternoon! You told me you were on the phone with your son as the verdict was coming in.
Yes, we were texting back and forth, and I was so nervous, because I've written a whole chapter on how I had to encounter race when raising my boy here, racism in America, as raising a brown-skinned boy, and just kind of waiting for, some sense of justice. And of course, he reminded me, he said, this is not justice, as you know. And I said, I know, but let me just take one deep exhale, And he said, yeah, because racism still needs to be sorted through. But, he was quick to, write like, okay, guilty on all 3 counts. And just for a moment, I mean, I wish I could have hugged him, but, it was the sense of like, okay, we can breathe a little bit now.
You had this remarkable passage and really timely for today towards the end of How to Raise a Feminist Son. And I feel like you should read it, but I can tell you where it is. Through the miracle of Post-its, it's, I think I can, wait. It's, Uh-oh, I'm lying. And so I'm going to read it.
Okay, go ahead.
Did you say Gibran?
Gibran.
Gibran. Gibran called me from college when he watched the Facebook Live video of Philando Castile dying after being shot by a policeman. Gibran was sobbing so hard I could barely understand his words. I tried to keep a calm voice. I asked him if he was scared. Not for myself, he said. I am relatively privileged. And then you go on to say, this vulnerable masculinity was the biggest gift I assembled for my child. A feminist life and a feminist lens, a feminist way of breathing, a feminist way of sobbing is more comfort than burden for my son. And such a strong passage, both in description and then in the analysis. And I wonder if you wanted to unpack it.
Thank you. Thank you for finding that passage and for reading it in your voice. Yeah, you know, when I moved to the US, my boy was 6 years old, so he's cute, and you know everyone loves him, and you know the cuteness of boys of color as just children. But then, even though I knew, of course, as a journalist and you know as a globally aware person and a woman, of course I knew of racism in America. But we were in Louisiana, and I was seeing some of that, but I wasn't introduced to the brutality of the country's racism and that sense of a knot in your chest until my son started to grow up. And the first thing I realized, of course, was my own sort of like the South Asian denial of racism in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, when my friend Cleo, who I think is watching, and I called her recently to say how sorry I am that when she would say, you know, this is racism in Baton Rouge, and I would say, oh, is it really? I was one of those, right? I would be like, explain to me why you think, etc. And then hearing the story of Emmett Till, which becomes so relevant today because his relatives were with the George Floyd family today when the verdict was read out. The 14-year-old who was murdered because a white woman said that he'd whistled at her, and then much later she said that she'd lied. And then looking at the intersections of Me Too and Black Lives Matter, I mean that's a that kind of case. And so when I am raising my son as a feminist in the US with its legacy of white supremacist, racist violence against boys of color, I slowly become aware of his masculinity, his vulnerability, so how do I take the masculinity and the vulnerability and make sense of it for raising a boy of color? And then of course, when he's 17 and we live in this beautiful upscale neighborhood in Queen Anne in Seattle, and he's climbing through the window because he's forgotten his keys and the neighbor calls the cops on him, and him at 17 knowing what that meant, and me not necessarily knowing, and this was just a few weeks before Trayvon Martin, we got to know of Trayvon Martin's case, and then recognizing that and seeing, oh my goodness, this world sees my boy as a man now and sees men of color as a threat, and getting to know more and more about that in America. And then also, as he says, recognizing his relative privilege, because we are South Asians, and who knows who sees what when they see my son, right? I'm still scared all the time. But so in this moment, being with him on the phone and knowing what this means for him, what that kind of that knot in my chest that is always there and has been there for Black mothers of sons and daughters and of kids in general, that we share all of this, and within that thinking of what it means to give him that vulnerability where he can cry over something like this. He doesn't have to buy into the Derek Chauvin brand of masculinity or any on that spectrum of masculinity, that feminism, because it has to be intersectional, has to be about about recognizing his place in the order of things, and then leaning into a feminist space in which he's allowed to cry because feminism allowed him that.
It's really nice to hear feminism brought to bear on these things as well as anti-racism, because the deadness of Chauvin throughout both the murder and the trial was such a strong force, and the sense in which, and it's something that I've often thought about, and Bell Hooks writes about beautifully, the way men have to kill off something within themselves before they can, kill off others. In the sense of this kind of dead man walking who was without empathy, without feeling, without, and you wonder, does he feel for himself? Or, there was all that bullshit about George Floyd's constricted artery, but there's some sort of constricted flow of perception and emotion in that man. And it's something that's such a part of this country. We create millions of soldiers and police who are trained to kill and to disassociate. And my partner lives near San Quentin prison, and we hear the target practice that the prisoners also hear. So the prisoners hear the guards practicing to kill them all the time. And just the incredible violence of this gun-riddled society, and the people who embrace that violence because they believe it serves them. And I think one of the things that you're trying to do that is really important, and maybe the most difficult thing of bringing men over to feminism, or telling them to wake the fuck up and get a life anyway, is that feminism benefits everyone. And that's part of what I loved about this passage at the end. A feminist way, a feminist lens, a feminist way of breathing, a feminist way of sobbing is more comfort than burden for my son. It's always felt like, how do we make patriarchy give up the idea that it's a zero-sum game and dominance is the best thing that can ever happen to you, and that actually being a full human being who can connect deeply to other human beings is an infinitely richer and more meaningful and more peaceful and more joyful way to live.
Yes, and you write about that in your book, with the experience of violence, and even about the violence that your friend was subjected to, the one that gave you her desk, the stabbing, and we see this kind of violence. I mean, I had violence from my father and my brother, and growing up with that. Yeah, and then even now when we're thinking about, oh my goodness, are we safe on Zoom? This constant, you call it this furtiveness when you were in your apartment, right? The first apartment, and this kind of furtive looking over your shoulder all the time, being careful about the Zoom chat and Zoom bombers, and this constant sense of something, that we are expected to flinch all the time, right? It can't be easy for the men around us, and the men that want to do well or do good. It can't be easy for them to know that their partners have to live this way. And so, so I appreciate that you write about that, and you write about, that this kind of expecting of violence, or of trauma, and the heaviness of that, carrying that around. It takes up so much headspace for us. It takes up so many hours of our lives. It takes invisible labor at work. It takes, emotional labor in everything that we do. That cannot be easy in the raising of children. It cannot be easy on our friends. It cannot be easy on men. And so, I mean, part of the whole thing of raising feminist men is for them to be aware of those things, and we can talk about that a little bit too, that they have to be aware of the impact that their kind has had on the world, right? If we even stay with talking about police, I was just reading up the statistics that police are 15 times more likely to abuse their wives and children than the general population. 15 times.
And that's who you have to call if you have an abusive spouse or stalker or something like that. Yes, there's a Cowboy Junkie song from the 90s about, and then you call a man with a gun who comes into your home, and it is this thing where the police are supposed to be what your resource is, and they're such a terrible resource. And then of course the New Yorker did a piece recently about what do you do when your abuser is law enforcement. It was a Southern case where a woman was being abused, I think, by a guy who was in the sheriff's department. His father was the head, and nobody would do anything about the domestic violence against her. And of course they did the whole, women are crazy, don't believe her, discrediting, which is so much part of it. But try convincing men what they lose, but also recognizing what we lose. And I wrote Recollections of My Nonexistence because there's a way I think we compartmentalize that either some dramatic case of fully realized violence happened to you, you had violent domestic abuse at home, physical violence, or you were raped or somebody tried to kill you. And then there's this whole framework, like if those things didn't happen to you, nothing happened to you. And I wrote about living under violent patriarchy with that, I grew up in a very violent household, but as an adult, I've been threatened and stalked and harassed and menaced and had, rape attempts and things. But I wanted to say that, as I say in the book, it gets you even if it doesn't get you. You have to think every day of your life as a young woman, as a girl and a young woman. If I wear this, what will happen? If I go out now, what will happen? Actually I had a funny interaction with a gay man yesterday on social media. He's a poet who's a man of color who's on Facebook and has decided to go on Twitter, and he picked a very provocative Twitter handle. And I made some remark, and then I realized, like, he has no fear of being provocative in a way. I'm just habitually like, don't bait the bears and don't poke the lion.
Mhm.
And it was just one of those little moments I have over and over of like, I'm almost 60 and I'm still on guard. I don't get targeted much now, but what happened to me as a young woman felt in a way like what men as a collective are doing is training women not to expect to be free and equal and confident. It's like a hazing, right? And that hits girls often when they're prepubescent and goes into your 20s, and it just tells you this is not your world, this is not your street, this is not your city, this is not your adventure, and then the movies tell you you are not the, and the books, you are not the protagonist, you are the Madonna or the whore, the helpmeet, or the the minor character, and so you just get so intensely instructed. And of course feminism is a project to unpack all that and find alternatives. And I feel like we've done remarkable work given that we're trying to dismantle things that are thousands of years old. And I also feel, and this could apply to today's verdict, that we lack in English an adequate way to express things are so much better than they have been, but they're also not nearly as good as they should be. And so we're in this middle ground, and with grounds to celebrate and grounds to fight and grounds to not stop.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes me think of this stories. You and I were emailing about stories, right? How do we tell women's stories and how do we center those stories? Because we've been told men's stories over and over again. And even if we think of the 15% of all police and who protects whom, we know that that's not the entire story. That's 15% is probably a minimal number because of what you said, that where women, if someone calls the police and the police protect each other, then we're clearly not getting the correct numbers because they sort of shut those cases down even before they can be reported. So we're not getting an accurate number. And so what are those stories, where we don't even have the numbers, leave alone the stories, if we must think only in terms of numbers. But also, you quote in your book David Morris, who wrote about PTSD and how women are 4 times, with survivors of rape, are 4 times more likely to suffer PTSD as compared to men who go to war, right? And I was just thinking of this, and I wish I had written this in the book. I mean, it's just out like 3 weeks or 2 weeks ago, and I feel like, oh no, I should go back in there, and I wish I changed that. That, you know, even when we talk about telling our stories of survival, right, and whether we can tell them as, you write that too, can we tell them as stories of heroism, right? Surviving violence, surviving rape, surviving walking down the street on any given day and coming back home. What if we were sitting around, say, a Thanksgiving table and telling our stories of surviving rape or surviving having been raped or assaulted the way men tell war stories, you know, because they can be wounded in war. They can be, and in fact, you know, if they are wounded in war, the more wounded, the better the story. Why
and
is
they get medals and all that, and parades and all that crap?
Exactly. And we can't even tell our stories about being raped, you know? So imagine if grandma suddenly started saying, oh, about that second time when I was sexually assaulted. Come on, gather around, children. And I know it sounds outlandish and we'll probably lose a few viewers here or participants, but you know, I mean, it only sounds outlandish because we've made it that way, because we've made it about shame on women. We've made it about, you know, women's bodies are not to be discussed. It's not polite. Whereas men's bodies going to war and being maimed or being harmed and coming back with bullet wounds is fair game. We can talk about that.
I think a really important point in that is that when a man comes home from the war, his family, you know, whoever he's telling his stories to are supposed to be on the same side as him. Whereas I'm sure you've had the experience I've had where you want to talk about the violence you've experienced and it makes men uncomfortable. And, you know, the more implicated they are, either as perpetrators upon you directly, you know, you can't really sit around and like, the time I stopped the guy from beating me, and by the way, it's your father at the head of the table. And, you know, you know, because this is a war at home and it's a war that's not over. And that's, I think that's part of what David Morris, who is himself a guy with PTSD and a veteran who was hit by an IED in Iraq, points out, is that there's no sort of honor for women as survivors. But I think also the war doesn't end, and you know, whether or not you're in Iraq, you don't, you know, as a woman, when are you away from, you know, from patriarchy? I've had moments in countries where there's a few countries where I feel really safe: Iceland, Ireland, and Japan. And I know they all have violence, but it felt like I was out of reach of it. And I've also had moments in the wilderness where, like, you know, I'm not going to face the things that I would face. You know, I'm not going to encounter random men because I'm in a really, really, really remote place. And I'm talking like, you know, latitude 81 and things like that, not just, you know, hiking where you run into weird guys on the trails as you do. And, but, you know, and that's the thing, is that men, you know, men are one way or another feel implicated. They may not be perpetrating it, but they often feel somehow implicated. And then they implicate themselves by not wanting to deal with it, which is perpetrating it. And that the only way to not perpetrate it is to be willing to address it. And so we have that kind of vicious cycle repeating itself and repeating itself. And I feel like it has changed to some extent. I feel like it'd be really interesting to hear what you think about this, because I feel like in late 2012, three things happened: the Steubenville rape case, a kind of crescendo of campus rape activism, but also the rape, murder, disembowelment of Jyoti Singh in New Delhi. And that all those things, and I think the feminist groundwork that had been laid for decades before, opened up space to talk more directly and compellingly about the impact of violence on all our lives. And social media allowed these huge choruses of tens of thousands of women adding their stories and supporting stories. And we started to talk, and I read about this in Recollections of My Nonexistence. We started to talk for what felt like the first time in my life an adequate way about violence against women, and not to treat rape and domestic violence and murder and workplace sexual harassment and street harassment and all the rest of it as a bunch of separate things, but to recognize what they had in common and recognize how they impact all of us. And
Yeah, it makes me think too, with some sadness that we've been talking about this for a long time, but it took us having access to media and to resources and to social media and to our own ways and avenues of storytelling to be able to bring this out in the open. I suspected as a young woman growing up, I suspected I wasn't the only one that had faced so much sexual assault or physical assault, but I couldn't run around asking everyone, have you, and so that's that. I mean, when I think back to, and I write about this in the book, that Bhavari Devi, this Dalit woman or lower caste woman in India years ago, and I was just about 20 or 21, and all those years ago, she talked about she took these men to court for sexually assaulting her. She was gang raped by upper caste men in India, and she had to, and of course the police dismissed her, and she had a terrible time getting them to believe her, but eventually led to the change in laws where the Supreme Court ruled that it was a case of workplace sexual harassment. And then she changes the laws for women, sort of like trickling up, right, for women at the workplace, because she was an activist and she was considered at the workplace and she was being punished for something that she'd done as an activist. So women have been talking about these things forever, and Dalit women in India have been talking about their gang rapes forever, but it wasn't a hashtag movement. It wasn't in, that then trickled up, and of course, mainstream media in the US and then in India had to cover it. So it takes access to these resources, and I think you write about this, and I have felt it all my life, that being able to tell my story and self-expression and being able to come to understanding that this was a story to be told is such a powerful thing, and it's such a gift. And I want so many women to tell their stories, especially South Asian women, where we have to explode this myth of the family. And you mentioned, the violence is someone sitting at the table. Often the story needs to be told about them. But the more we do it, the more it can be done. That it won't feel as dangerous, because you'll see people who made it to the other side, who did it and they made it to the other side.
I had a woman older than me tell me probably around 2015 or 16 about being gang raped, and the doctor she went to blamed her, and then she just never told anybody else for 40 years. And it is interesting because we're hearing a lot of old stories, because that was one of the things that's been shocking about Bill Cosby and Weinstein, to name the two highly public figures who I think represent a lot of much more low profile stuff that happens, is that there was I hate it when people say somebody was voiceless. Nobody is voiceless, but they often don't have anybody who will listen to them. Either they'll be blamed and shamed and disbelieved, or they'll be punished or exist under threat. And women get killed for telling their stories quite regularly. And but to see that they had this impunity that went on for decades, and that we finally had this kind of watershed. I think a lot of it was because of what is often seen as a really bourgeois feminism, but that feminists, both women and people of other genders who had a feminist perspective, were finally the people who were the judges, the assignment editors, the TV producers, the sexual assault detectives, et cetera, that we finally had enough people in place who made the decisions about, does this matter? Who do I listen to? Because, there's so much gross stuff when I was young to kind of lie back and enjoy it. And, it the conservatives blamed women who got raped, and and there was a whole other side. And I grew up during the so-called sexual revolution here in the Bay Area, which meant that by the time you were 12, adult hippie dudes were hitting on you. And there's this ethos that all sex was good. And feminism of the 80s kind of finally gave us the tools to recognize that sex is about power. Power is distributed unequally. Unequal power often leads to abuse and exploitation. And to finally have some ammunition after sort of puritanical culture to say, leave that 12-year-old girl alone. And but the 70s were so gross. And it's something that isn't much talked about, but it's kind of a context for, Woody Allen's Manhattan, which was the last movie of his I ever saw, because I'm the same age as Mariel Hemingway, and it was so clearly a movie about a super creepy guy, and you could just see her kind of cringing and flinching her way through the movie as while being blamed as though she was the sexual aggressors. And I saw a clip of it in the Woody Allen documentary on HBO, the first thing I'd seen since the 70s, and it's like, I hate Woody Allen. He is so gross. We should talk about movie watching though, because I think, that's where your book opens, watching movies with your son. It's such a wonderful part of the book, in talking about how even this pleasure and recreation is an occasion for education, and also how feminism can be fun, and that the two of you have a lot of fun looking at movies from this analytical perspective. Whose story is it? Who is it centered on? And did we like it? Do we buy it?
Yeah, and even now, he was here last week, and we were watching the Gilmore Girls together again and again, talking, years later, talking about the characters all over again and the single mother in it, and how that was the first time we were seeing something like that represented. But yes, let's talk about movies. I was thinking too about Woody Allen, and about how I still haven't won that battle, Rebecca. I still, with my talking to my son and saying, I don't know if I can watch that documentary about Woody Allen. And I believed
Dylan
Farrow for the longest time, and I don't want to watch it, or I have to be really prepared to watch it. And my son said, well, you should watch it and maybe we'll talk. And, because he just loves the movies, and that has that whole thing about separating the man from the art. And I feel like how many women were separated from making art because of men of this kind, and yet what I want to hold on to are the better moments, I think. For instance, I was thinking of watching 8th Grade together, and I forget the name of the filmmaker. I wish I remembered. If someone,
what was it called?
8th Grade, the movie. Have you not seen it?
I have not seen it.
Oh, you must see it. It's totally from the point of view of a young woman in 8th grade, a young white girl. And, she's a vlogger, video blogger, and all about the insecurities. But this was the moment in which I felt it was the first time after the Me Too revelations that we was seeing something like that play out on the big screen, in a feature film. There was a moment, and so my son was home from college, and we'd gone to see the movie, and there's a moment in it where, without giving spoilers, but there's the young girl who's in 8th grade is alone. She's being dropped home. They were in a group, and she's being dropped home by an older young man, a boy. And he hits on her and tries to, pressure her into having sex. And she's kind of like, I don't know. And then she feels self-conscious and feels like it may have been the cool thing to do. And she says, don't tell the others that I refused. And, that all that confusion and the preying upon a young girl and her insecurities. And my son next to me in the seat was like, oh God, this is difficult to watch, the poor thing, and getting what she was feeling and voicing it. And he doesn't like to talk much in the movie theater, but he had to voice it, and I could see him squirming for her. And it was just such a sense of, he's away at college, and I have been trying to talk to him about things like, date rape and campus rapes and things like that. And it's okay. I can feel some sense of relief because he gets it, he gets. And so later, as we left, I asked him, what were you thinking in that scene? He said, oh God, it was so hard to watch because, she thought that she was in the wrong. She thought that she was not being cool by saying no to him. And it might be so true for so many girls, and he's not performing for me because that's the last thing he wants to do, it's not cool to, give his mom those moments, but they sort of arrive and they arise, and it was such a relief, so there are moments like that. And then there are moments like, what is that, Mad Max Fury Road, going to watch that. Have you seen that?
I did with such mixed feelings. Let's talk about it. How did you two read it?
Well, I definitely enjoyed big, aspects of it, and there was, some catharsis to it. But I was more interested in the way the man was being represented in that. And there was this moment where she takes, he's not able to shoot or something, right? And even though it's such a violent moment, she takes the gun from him and she says, okay, you cannot do this, let me do it. And I just kind of like whooped. There was this moment where we're being shown, like, it's not even like he gets a great comeback or something in the film, and so that was very satisfying to me. And I sort of like whooped, and he was like, oh my goodness, don't, he was self-conscious, and he said, gosh, like, people are watching the movie. And I said, it was a moment in which he needed to see the spectator in me as his mother, as a woman watching a movie where there's something that satisfies her. And I thought that was an important moment. But I'd love to know what you thought of the film. Let's talk about that Mad Max.
There's a bunch of layers to it. One, I love feminist female action figures. I think one of the first things I ever saw, there's a Hong Kong action movie called Heroic Trio with three of the great sort of Chinese actresses in it. My friend Valerie So, who's an Asian studies, film studies professor, took me to when we were young in the late 80s, early 90s. But Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games, La Femme Nikita, anytime I get one of these really powerful women, I get all revved up, and I've written about this, I get kind of excited. And then sometimes I walk away and I'm like, okay, I've had like 10 movies in my life, and a lot of men have 10 a week. And it really feels like I'm doing, snorting crystal meth or something, because I get all revved up and feel super invulnerable. I'm like, I could do these things, which of course, not particularly. And then I think like, wow, if you had a steady diet of that from, early childhood with Superman and Batman and everything else, it would really warp you. And of course, what we do see a lot, we watched a horrible movie during the pandemic. It's called like The Immortals or something. It's about these people who are immortal, and and it's like, there's this woman who's lived for like 3,000 years, and she can't think of anything better to do than be a commando who keeps getting blown up and magically springing back to life to continue sort of hand-to-hand combat. And it's like, if I was 3,000 years old, I'd like to think I made some spiritual progress or something. And what I do see a lot is the inability to imagine beyond a very masculine idea of the violent and alienated individual as the protagonist. And I wrote a piece I was very happy with called "When the Hero is the Problem." I think it was called that. It was there was an Icelandic movie where a woman is committing eco-sabotage. And she has a house with pictures of Nelson Mandela and Gandhi in it. And it's like, you fucking idiot. Did you know that what Gandhi and Mandela were really good at doing is organizing? This woman is also a choir director. And if you can get 40 people to sing in harmony, you can build a movement. And instead she's like got all these physically awesome stuff and is like crawling across the lavascape, evading the helicopters and sabotaging stuff. And it's like, that's not actually how you change the world, and then of course it turns out what she really wants is a baby, because it's, and that the movie was just gross. So what I rarely see, and in Mad Max, God, what was it called? Road Warrior,
Fury Road.
Fury Road. Yes, there's so many combos. I'm glad Mel Gibson is over anyway. But was this, the protagonist is awesome because she excels at violence and is really tough and stoic, and her bionic arm and makes her even more superhuman and cyborgy and stuff. And they finally come to this kind of matriarchal society that seems like it's going to be a lot better. But the filmmakers clearly couldn't imagine making a whole movie about a matriarchal nonviolent society. And there was also a lot of kind of cheesy exploitation in how the noble young women were portrayed and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But you see that a lot. And the Hunger Games crushed me because it was such a compelling story, and it ended up, in the third one in endless cynicism because they couldn't imagine, idealism, non-corruption, solidarity, mutual aid. They couldn't imagine a better society than the one they were rebelling against. And then it got all kind of Voltaire, we will just tend our gardens on us. And it was super disappointing. But Katniss was awesome while she lasted and made Jennifer Lawrence get to do some of that again.
Yeah, well, it also does bother me, of course, that it's Jennifer Lawrence and Charlize Theron, and that kind of body.
Supermodels,
The supermodel body, and the that is always, as you're pointing out, that it's the terms and the narratives and all of that, and the action is all on the same terms as male protagonists, and the violence. In Fury Road, though, I did like, the part that I was drawn to was his as some people would think, demasculation, but what masculinize, whatever the word, but the fact that it wasn't necessarily something that he came to again in the end and took the gun back, that we would see.
That moment is great, where we don't have to assuage the male ego when a woman is actually more qualified to do something.
Right, yeah, but I totally agree.
Reminiscent of a million office and professional situations. I'm sorry, I know that. I'm sorry, I'm good at this. Excuse me for being intelligent. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be.
Like Sandra Bullock in what was that, The Proposal, where she has to get in touch with her feminine side a little bit and not be as as ambitious or as committed to work. So yeah, I'm tired of those. I want more movies like 8th Grade. I'm so glad that I've given you a reference of something to go watch later. I think we have questions.
We do have questions. Let's take a look at them.
We were told to look for the upvoting, right? Okay, I see one right at the top. Should we take?
Okay. Shall I read it aloud?
Yeah, that'll be great.
Do you think that if men knew more about the experiences, sexual assault, harassment, rape of the women close to them, that there would be more understanding of how feminism is relevant to them? I'm thinking about a time I recommended Hannah Gadsby's Nanette to a male friend, and his response was, I'm not one of those guys, I don't need to watch it. A great question.
Oh, it's a terrific question. Thank you, Laura Zira. I can take a stab at it, and then maybe I'd love to know what you think too. I think definitely. I mean, that's why I say in the book that talk to your young, a teenager or at an age appropriate time, talk to them about the Me Too stories about sexual assault and harassment and rape, because a lot of them, if we haven't talked to them, a lot of them actually, the ones that don't do such things and are not that type of guy, they don't know that this kind of thing exists. I remember this time in my classroom when I asked women about walking around at night, and they said, yeah, I hold my keys in my hand, or I hold my cell phone and pretend I'm talking to him. And so they talked about all these strategies, and the young men in the classroom had not, and I'm doing the binary thing, but the cis het guys did not know about this, that the women that they were sitting next to in the classroom had all these processes for just walking down the street at night. So I definitely think that once they become aware of that, one, they're going to be aware of the way their bodies are, that if they are too close up to a woman, that she's probably afraid, at night. If they're walking down a street and, someone is sort of being careful, then they need to understand that. And then, and become aware of public space for women, especially in India. Public space is not built for women, most public spaces. And of course, Hannah Gadsby's Nanette is just amazing. And I think men, we need to sit down. I've sat and watched it with a man and wept, and it's really important for me to see how they respond to my weeping, to whether they believe how pervasive something like that is, and getting those conversations started. And I think things like her show Nanette are a great way to start. So yes, we definitely need to talk about that and watch these things with them and use those as opportunities to get into those conversations. What do you think?
It's been so interesting during this, whatever we're going on for 8 years or so now, of really talking about violence against women, having that conversation I was so hungry for when I was young and targeted, and everybody just wanted to tell me how to adapt to it, like it was weather, dress like a man, cut off your hair, buy a gun, don't ever leave the house alone, move to the suburbs with money you don't have, own a car, take a taxi, utterly curtail your freedom forever. And and there's an element of willfulness in not knowing about it, and just to say, I'm not one of those guys, I don't need to watch it. And one of the things that really struck me pretty late in if we decide I'm a feminist, at least from the point when I wrote my first piece about violence against women in 1985, and a very imperfect feminist then and now, but also very much on my own then I realized relatively recently that I had accepted what I think almost everyone has accepted, which is that feminism is women's work, which the equivalent would be saying that anti-racism is the work of people of color. We haven't actually said Black people should create a non-racist society without white people doing a damn thing. But we have essentially said that to women, that somehow we should just be so awesome and heroic and invulnerable, and in a society in which pretty all of us are contaminated by misogyny, find men who are completely non-misogynist, and that we should just be super amazing in ways that are insultingly impossible, and that's what is, and so it's really interesting to me to realize that, yeah, in a lot of ways we haven't asked men to do their part. And one of the things that's been interesting the last several years is more telling men that they have to do bystander interventions, they have to address locker room talk. One of the remarkable things about Chanel Miller's case, and she's the victim of the Stanford rapist, Brock Turner, is that it was 2 Swedish graduate students who tackled this athlete who was assaulting her while she was blacked out. And that's why there was even a story rather than just like, and why there was a case and why there was a conviction. And it was also really interesting because those 2 men were really deeply, I don't think they became too public, but they seemed like deeply feminist men, and they were deeply traumatized from what she wrote about them by, having seen something so grotesquely dehumanizing happen. And that's something I think we don't talk about enough. And I'm so interested in indirect consequences. I don't like that thing where we tell men that, like, you should care about women because you have sisters and wives and mothers and stuff. It's like, you should care about women because they're human. Fuck you. And pardon all my profanity in this one, but
I love it.
And but also, that the woman who's getting beaten has a little boy who sees it, and it impacts him, even if he doesn't grow up to be a wife beater, seeing his mother, terrified and traumatized like that. That's another strong thing about Chanel's book, is she writes about how her new partner and her family were so impacted by what happened to her, and then also men need to understand that living in a world where women pay the tax of misogyny, or are so, which means lack of freedom and equality, second guessing, will people get angry if I have the bright idea in the meeting, if I know the answer, if I'm the little girl who raises my hand in third grade a lot because I'm very excited about science. So like they you know, they are advantaged by our disadvantage. So, you know, I'm not one of those guys, I don't need to watch it, is an anti-systemic way of thinking. And I feel that around, you know, intersectional human rights, we have to understand, just as I'm advantaged by my whiteness in a society that holds non-white people back, we have to understand that we're implicated even if we're not one of the bad guys, and that it's not somebody else's problem to solve. And in a funny way, it's like it would almost be a fun assignment with you, and you know, like you could watch any movie and have a conversation about feminism, whether it's a Woody Allen movie or a great feminist movie, if there are any, or, you know, Katniss Everdeen in the Hunger Games or anything, you know, that this is all around us and in everything and always ready to be discussed. So yeah, and I know we're running out of time, although it doesn't feel like nearly enough. Okay, I'm looking, let me look at, okay. Do you want to just go to the next one?
Yeah,
How did the definition of feminism evolve for you over the years? Which I think I just kind of addressed myself.
um, yeah, that's from Simone Misra. And I would just add to that it definitely, for me, it did, because, you know, it started as resistance, and it started, I think I say too in the book, that it was a feeling before it was a practice, or before it was a focus. And, you know, and so we knew of, you know, this feeling of something being horribly wrong and something being unfair, and then coming to feminism and recognizing, oh my goodness, this is a shared experience, and that you can resist, you know, you can put up a resistance to it to the extent that one can, right? So I think in the beginning, for me as a young woman, it was about resistance, and now it is more about building a movement, building solidarity, raising feminist sons. It's really, really important to me, you know, not just sons, but men in general, like getting at masculinity, like just going to the heart of toxic masculinity and trying to, you know, sort of like dislodge it, you know, and say it's sort of mess with it a little bit. So I think that's how it's evolved over the years, and that I feel much more at peace now, even though I get very, very angry, but there's a sense of it can be done, rather the sense of feeling frustrated and that it's too insurmountable and I don't have solidarity. I mean, here you are and here I am, and I feel incredibly grateful for this kind of solidarity and this learning from you. So is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. Did the definition of feminism evolve for you over the years? I think it's evolved for all of us, because so many new ideas and perspectives that have kind of deepened and broadened and enriched what feminism is have happened. And it feels like it just, you know, it's snowballing. I was asked by a French interviewer years ago, like, what would you tell younger women? And I was like, nothing, because they're the ones who are educating me. I still have baggage that they don't have. They see further, they demand more, they're more naturally intersectional, you know, less, you know, they have less baggage to shed. So, and it's just so interesting, you know, and I think all of these things are unfinished projects. Something really interesting happened. Somebody wrote something really remarkable and educational for me after the murder of the Korean American woman. You know, was that last month? It feels like the pandemic time has continued what Trump time is, which is a kind of incoherence. But after that massacre, somebody wrote that intersectional doesn't mean what we thought it meant. It means that, you know, it's like a multiplier, that your ethnicity multiplied by your gender creates a particular result that's different, and that, you know, white women are seen as helpless and innocent and you know, and trophies. Black women are seen as powerful and angry and dangerous. You know, East Asian women are seen as hypersexual, you know, and I was talking about how different, you know, I'm not representing it well. And but it talked about how differently, according to your ethnicity, your feminine, your gender is treated. And it was really, it made intersectionality mean something better. I'll go back and reread the passage, which I, printed or whatever, turned into a PDF for future reference. So, so I think, it just keeps changing, and it's exciting because I think it's gotten so much better, and we, it's so much more intersectional, and it's, now the overlaps with queer culture and trans culture are also so strong. And, so that there's a sense I have of a united human rights movement, and we have outliers, people who think they're feminists who are transphobes, who are wrong and should get over it or go away. But, and it's just exciting to see it continue to grow. And I feel like there's a certain smugness we in movements get, but I always think about, okay, we see all these things those bad people in 1965 didn't see, but what are the people in 2050 going to see that we're totally missing now? And I'm really interested in how awareness continues to develop, and looking at the trajectory of awareness around disability, or, gender binaries, or any one of those things.
Yeah, that stuff really excites me, and my students excite me. When I listen to them and their feminism and the way, I feel like please let me be part of that. Just kind of like learning from them and being able to eavesdrop and see how much further they're taking it. It's beautiful. At what age is it appropriate to talk to our sons about our own sexual assaults? I can answer that really quickly. I did that at around 14 and 15, but in the book I quote a therapist, a psychologist, who talks about how you have to build the language very early on. So be talking about the body and saying, oh, when you ran, did you feel the wind on your face? It was exhilarating. Or, oh, your stomach hurts, that's pain, that must be terrible. So that if they're used to talking about pain and pleasure in their bodies, that when you eventually raise things about, consent and sex and sexuality, that it doesn't feel like, oh my God, I cannot talk about this, I cannot talk about the body and about women and, and sex. So I think it all depends on the comfort of your family, your the culture and everything. But I think, let those things not stop us from it. Let within those contexts we can talk about these things, and maybe consulting a therapist, which is the thing that I didn't do and I regret. But again, I forgive myself for that, and it's all worked out fine. But I wish that I hadn't been anguished while talking about that I wish that I had been able to talk about it earlier and sort of built it up in a way. So that's something that others can still do. Oh, this might be a good one for you. I would love for you to answer this. What harm did Trump do to feminism? My goodness, what didn't he? Or did he light a fire under the movement? Is it easier to avoid toxic masculinity now that he's gone?
And the Trump era was so polarizing, to use an overused word, in that I think it both gave cover to a lot of misogynists and white supremacists, and who seemed to be the same people most of the time. And it did so right away. And as soon as he was elected, and one of my relatives in LA talked about an Asian American woman, a man grabbing her at a bus stop saying, "Trump is president, I can do this." And, he really gave people license to be their worst selves in so many ways. But he also made the case for why we need feminism. Me Too happened, and some people think that Me Too, which is important to stress, was not some brand new thing that landed from Mars, but was like a next phase of feminism long built by feminists. But, that happened in 2017. And so a lot of people think in reaction to him. And, these movements have continued to grow. And I do think that the future of this country is a feminist, non-white majority, population that believes in universal human rights and genuine equality. And that's part of why white supremacist misogynists are going so crazy, is that they're losing, and this is backlash. And, but like the coup wasn't ever going to succeed on January 6th, they're never going to make America 1958 again. And so I don't know. And he did both harm and laid bare why it matters. And so I don't know. What do you think? And then we should probably call it an event.
Yeah.
People leave if they have,
yeah.
you know.
I think we're out of time, but yeah, I totally agree with everything you're saying. I wish bad things didn't have to happen in order for good things to happen. But I think that's what ended up being true. So that's a good place to end. And yes,
Okay.
thank you for being.
Thank you. I'm going to bring forward, for those of you who didn't see it, a Bay Area person's drawing of George Floyd, and which is where we started. And rest in power, George Floyd.
Rest in
May your
power.
memory be a blessing.
Well, I could have used another hour. This has been such a wonderful conversation. I want to thank you both so much for joining us tonight. And thank you everyone out there in the audience for joining us as well. Politics and Prose can't continue to do these great events like this without the book sales to support them. So please use the link that I put in the chat to purchase the books on the Politics and Prose website. And while you're there, check out the events page for future events with other wonderful authors. And in the meantime, stay well, everyone, and stay well read. And thank you, ladies, both so much. Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you so much. Thank you, independent bookstores. Thank you, Sonora. Thank you, this wonderful book. Thank you, Feminism. Thank you, listeners.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Take care.